All right, so this is part 2 of U.S. History B, Civil War, and covering things again as we combine from those in Mr. Baldwin's class and those with the student teacher with Mr. Thorne, trying to cover a couple threads here and parallels that then we can combine together and move forward, hitting on our liberty versus security and also the different goals that 3rd and 5th hour set. As a side note for housekeeping issues, I've gotten responses, meaning assignments, from most of the students in both sections for the song assignment, which is encouraging. I have to say, compared to our sophomores and freshmen from like World Civ, the juniors and a couple of you who are seniors are being more up to snuff when it comes to submitting of assignments and so forth. So I'm encouraged by that. So kudos to you guys. Please keep lending that helping hand digitally if there's people who are having a hard time. What was that YouTube channel again? And what was the assignment? Or what are we doing now? And just remind them, okay, now that the song assignment has been turned in with the appropriate extra credit link, if you did try to share with me the song, as I share with you, Star Spangled Banner's version done by Whitney Houston was probably my favorite song. Beyond that, help the students remember that going forward, you just copy and do the guided notes here for this section on A House Divided, and it will culminate in, we'll see on the 30th again if we're actually back in school, but on the 31st, regardless, we'll be taking a test on both A House Divided and Empire Strikes Back, right? One of these videos will most likely be a review video, so that we'll go through and just help you in taking the test, right? So that's the plan, and make sure I'm not forgetting anything on that. And that's housekeeping items, so yeah, let's get into it on House Divided Part 2. We left off last time talking about Andrew Jackson. He was an interesting president, to say the least, and historically has been rated as probably the most unfavorable president in U.S. history by every part of the political spectrum. He was a very strong-armed individual. Many political cartoons had him as, you see in the textbook and stuff about him stamping on the Constitution. He was a very dictatorial president. Sometimes generals who are presidents, whether it's President Grant or President Eisenhower, sometimes they're sort of out of their element. They're usually in a general war room, so to speak, as opposed to being the civilian commander-in-chief, and they're not used to that position. Jackson took it as a way of being more of a military strongman. And we saw it last time with the Black Hawk War. That was, and I say war in quotes, that was rough. And we do cover these times that are unfortunate, not just to be like, look at what the U.S. has done, but you can only truly, as our theme in the class of knowing there's two sides to every argument, you only can truly see the greatness, the beauty that our country has been able to accomplish by understanding some of its depths, right? And as we get to Reconstruction, there's some really good things that happen. As we get to Industrial Revolution, there's some really good things that happen. But there's always that theme of at what cost, right? At what cost? Okay, so on the back of the page, right, or at least the back of the page that you guys have digitally, under A House Divided, you should see the section entitled 5 Civilized Tribes. And we're going to have a total of 5 total things that you can write down in this section. And then we'll finish off with Indian resistance. Under 5 Civilized Tribes, remember we talked about it before last time how individuals, when settling, would call the American Indians and Native Americans noble savages, right? And it's not good, not great, but also not horrible because they still recognize a sense of nobility. But then you also tailor that to what, under Jackson's reign, the idea of savages has a little bit more of weight to it. Now, the idea of civilized tribes is these were 5 found in the southeastern portion of the United States at this time. Remember, this is post-Louisiana Purchase. You have the Great Midwest Territories, Northwest Territories, areas that are growing out past, not really Mexican-American War, but or even the Spanish American, you can see past that angle westward expansion, right? You have untamed lands, new lands, desolate lands. I mean, let's be honest, everything past west of the Mississippi, for those of you who see it here, is pretty desolate. When you go back to, I mean, you do have past the range that we have, yes, the tip of the Rockies, you want to look at it past Donner Pass in the west, and you do have the west coast in terms of vegetation, humidity, all of that stuff, arable land. But there's a big gulf from Mississippi until that range. Man, like Lake Tahoe, if you want to call it that. There is a big gulf of actual arable land. And so the U.S. discovered that, right? I mean, they wanted to claim that, annex that, and understandably, it makes it more sense geographically to expand out there. But you also then have the density and the congestion on the southeast of what was, you're talking about Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, you're talking about Florida. These areas that just were becoming more and more dense. Traditional United States citizens were having more and more conflicts with areas of sovereign recognized land contained by these specific tribes. Now, we're not going to talk about every tribe, but these 5 tribes were the ones that were affected by what we'll now know as the Trail of Tears. And they were called civilized in terms of treaties back and forth. These 5 were known as civilized tribes in contracts and legalese, that they were not out massacring individuals or ransacking towns. There was conflict. These were not innocent bystanders, if you will, involved in a conflict. They too were fighting for their own lands and rights. But congestion made it more and more. So we saw from before that Black Hawk War was a big point of conflict. We saw from before that the Native Americans were becoming more desperate in terms of how can they have a retention of land rights without getting pushed out, right, and being peaceful. So we saw all that, and that led to these 5 different groups. So the first thing you're going to write down in this section under civilized tribes, and I want you to write it down in this particular order, sort of in least important until most important. The first one is Creek, so like you would spell Creek, Creek. Next one is Chickasaw, so Chickaasaw. The third one is Choctaw, Chotaw. And as a side note, I've always wondered, I've heard this, I don't know if it's real or not, but those of you who are University of Kansas fans, Rock Chalk, right? They have that big saying for their basketball team, etc. Some have made the connection that being forcefully led out of those areas and lands from the East Coast to more of the Midwest, in Kansas specifically, could be for the Choctaw Indians, maybe a connection there for rock chalk. Some have also said it's like there's the chalk magnesiate that's found in the rock there, and so that's why they say rock chalk. But either way, they're moving west. That's not the original place. Many people assume those in Oklahoma or Kansas or Nebraska, those who are on Native American reservations, even in Texas, like that's where they were. No, that is not where they were. That's not where they originated. It's not like the U.S. then built a fence around them and said, you've got reservations. That is not how it is. I want to dispel that myth. When you get to Arizona, Utah, Nevada, yeah, you'll see Navajo. You'll see a couple other reservations and tribes that like that's where they originated, and because it's not very arable land, the U.S. didn't claim it as much, right? Okay. And I also want to give another side note. This is me, Mr. Gordon Peer, not passing judgment on the U.S. government and saying, how dare you want to expand land, ease territorial claims, help find a better way of life, and expand that for more people. That isn't inherently evil. It just had a couple heavy costs ethically, historically, and it makes our manifest destiny, it's an interesting claim for it. Okay, and having come from the East Coast and seeing out west, I can sort of, not having a Trail of Tears experience, I can see though still the west area just isn't as arable, and that's a hard thing, especially for Native Americans who are used to having the East Coast arable land, meaning farmable land. Okay, the fourth one, and this is where like you probably want to put a star by them. This is an important group, hint that you're going to be aware of, is the Cherokee. Cherokee. I think it's like a Jeep Grand Cherokee or whatever. We've taken some of the names, but this is the Native American tribe Cherokee. And the fifth and final one you're going to write down is Seminole. 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 Think of the Florida State Seminoles, right? Prominent college football, basketball team, etc. And they've taken, the Seminole tribe has allowed them to take that mascot because it's a joint venture, and they make proceeds from like the sales and such. Heck, their football games, they have an actual Seminole tribesman come out on traditional warhorse and stake a spear in the ground that's on fire. It's like, and it's not done out of disrespect or overgeneralization or stereotypical behavior. It's done in a really cool way that's respectful. And you'll get to why the Seminoles have this unique relationship with Americans, U.S. citizens, compared to other tribes. But those are the five groups, right? So you got Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, and Seminole. Cherokee and Seminole you want to have a star by, because we'll get to that. Now let's get to our second thing you're going to write down. The second thing is the Indian Removal Act. This is a very harsh one. It was approved by Jackson and the Congress. It's not just Jackson here, and the Congress. Approved by Jackson and the Congress. The act forced all Indian tribes to sell their lands to the federal government. It forced all Indian tribes to sell their lands to the federal government. Forced all Indian tribes to sell their lands to the federal government. This is, now, it's not just these five tribes, but these are the ones that are displaced the most. These are the ones that really face the brunt of it. This is a blanket act that says, we are forcing you. Yes, we understand that you're a sovereign nation or country in and of itself, but we're forcing you still to sell your lands to the federal government. It's a contract or negotiation by gunpoint. I'm trying to think of the right analogy here, but heck, I don't want to minimize this, but for many of you, not that I would have you raise your hand, when you look at it for your parent relationship, heck, I've done this to my own kids too, where I say, well, look, honey, this is your decision. Natalie, my middle child, this is your decision. You can choose to wear all of this makeup on or not have any food for 3 weeks. That's not really a choice. That's not a choice involved there. Please don't call DCFS on me. I jokingly say that. I'm not actually going to take food away from my daughter that way. But there are many times that like we put ultimatums out there as parents, and you guys have suffered this, and you're like, don't pretend like this is a choice. Like, all right, honey, you have a choice between either having your curfew at 10 or revocation of all car, media, and TV viewing privileges. And it's such a harsh negotiation that it's not really a decision at all. But it's your choice. It's like, it's not my choice. I have no choice really in it. The Indians were part of that. Okay. Now I do want to take a step back. So we've gotten down two things in this section on the 5 civilized tribes. I mentioned this before, I alluded to it. The Worcester versus Georgia case, which is not anything you need to actually know of. I'm not going to test you on it. For those of you who go to law school, it is a seminal, no pun intended, case, a landmark case dealing with land rights. It is the first case that most property law students will study. The Worcester versus Georgia case was impressive because in the 1830s, Georgia was basically telling specifically Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, these tribes, what to do with their lands. Like, well, we're going to shift you over here, and you got to abide by these rules. Even though in previous court cases, these individuals have been recognized. Heck, even in our Constitution and Declaration, sort of, they recognize them as sovereign states, meaning they get to rule themselves. In this court case, federal judges, federalist judges who still gave a lot of power to the federal government, still was like, there's no way around this. Even though we like the land and we want to tell them what to do, and it's very much a inconvenience for us, and we want to just tell them how to do things. It was interesting that when this case came out, the Supreme Court judges had a majority decision that said, look, you cannot, the ruling that you want to have and the significance of it is, the U.S. government cannot tell another sovereign nation what to do with its own rights and land and people. There it is, nothing. So you can't tell them what to do with their land, you can't take it. it would completely destroy any viability for an Indian Removal Act. Didn't work. It's the only time, even FDR, who tried to bully the court, as we'll get to a little bit later, a different type of Democratic president, even FDR, no one had the audaciousness, the audacity of what Jackson did. The court came out and said it, and Jackson sort of famously said, well, let them defend their own decision. What, they're going to come out with their robes and like some guns and tell us what to do? He says that. He says that, releases in the newspapers. Let them defend their own decision. But that's not the role of the executive or legislative branch, even though, as we'll get to with constitutional review, as a teacher, I wonder constitutionally some of the tricky parts of constitutional or judicial review, where they can strike down laws and so forth. But the fact that is with that power, the court still makes that claim that you can't mess with them. And like in every other time in U.S. history, when the court comes back and says, this is what it's going to be, people eventually get on board with it. Not the case under Worcester versus Georgia. Not the case at all. So this is what spurs on, promulgates the start of the Indian Removal Act. Because Jackson's like, I'm not going to listen to the court. Who are they? The Supreme Court? Yeah, they are, and they don't actually get listened to. And it was, thinking of the analogy here, where, if Principal Swenson were to have a directive and certain stipulations on pack hour behavior, and if Mr. Bennion were to just say, like, Mr. Swenson's got to punch me in the face to force me to actually follow this law. I'm going to take all the students out during pack hour, and we're going to go on a ride of our lives in the town. Everybody's jaw would drop and be like, what? Like, that's unheard of. You can't expect him, Mr. Bennion, to do that, or Mr. Jones to do that. You've got to fall in line. That's how audacious it was. In other countries, it happens all the time, but the U.S. is very normally based in a constitutional backing. Jackson was not following the Constitution at all. And the Congress went along with him because it was a mood of the people, too. And so that led to the Indian Removal Act. Worcester versus Georgia is still the precedent of the land, but that didn't save the Native Americans at all. At all. Okay, so now our third thing we're going to write down is Jackson sent all of his federal troops, all of them, 7,500. Jackson sent all of his federal troops, 7,500, to force the Cherokee to sell their lands. Forced all 7,500 of his federal troops to force the Cherokee to sell their lands in Georgia. Right, goes back to Georgia. Cherokee were probably the most numerous of all of these individual tribes. In fact, you look on the Oklahoma license plate, you'll see Dreamcatcher, sort of the traditional idea. Cherokee, to this day, the reservations in Oklahoma, okay, that's not where they were at all. And if any of you have been to Oklahoma comparing it to, say, Georgia, world of difference, world of difference. As a side note, it's really cool. The Creek Indians are interesting in that some have said, I'm not saying this is true, if you remember from like U.S. history, Roanoke Island, which is like this grand mystery that we don't really know what happened, aliens or extinction or starvation, cannibalism. Some of the thoughts have been that they may have been married in out of desperation or out of choice to some of the local Indian tribes. One of them that's a potential idea is the Creek tribe. Historically, those of members of the Creek, which is not a huge tribe, have had very interesting facial features, skin tone, to where if you didn't know any better, they looked what would be typically a Caucasian or Anglo-Saxon mix. It's really interesting. Don't take that for gospel truth, so to speak, because historians cannot conclude that. But the Creek are an interesting tribe. So that's what makes this whole travesty worse, is the Creek tribe looks so similar to the same people pushing them out. All right, so then the fourth thing that you're going to write down is, after separating the 6,000 Cherokee into 1,000 person groups, right? So they separate the 6,000 Cherokee individuals into 1,000 person groups. So there isn't like a revolt and so forth. After separating them into those different groups, the troops forced the Indians to march over 800 miles from Georgia to Oklahoma. The troops forced the Cherokee 1,000-person groups to march 800 miles from Georgia to Oklahoma in winter. In winter. Utah has a unique history and tradition, and think about it, contemporaries, if you will, of 1830s. Heck, what's going on not too far from there, time-wise, is, the advent of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Utah has a unique empathy, I believe, for those who have been forcibly displaced. Heck, even when you go back to the refugee crisis that was happening in Syria, Utah was still accepting those refugees. That doesn't mean it's good or bad or otherwise. It's just showing, as students in a Utah history class, there is a unique empathy in terms of a displacement of 800 miles, right? And for some of you, many of you, you'd look at this and say, yeah, this is what the federal government does. That, for most U.S. citizens, that's not the takeaway, right? And I don't think that should be the takeaway, because there's a couple incidents in U.S. history where the federal government, either turned and looked the other way or got hasty when it came to displacing of people. Okay. In parentheses, at this fourth thing, right? So they're forcibly moved to go 800 miles from Georgia to Oklahoma. You want to put in parentheses, this was called, quote, Trail of Tears. This is called the Trail of Tears. Okay. The last thing you're going to write down here is only half survived. Only half survived. The Cherokee Nation was decimated. Many of the tribes were decimated from this forcible death march. Some historians have tried to claim this as genocide. Look at South Sudan or Darfur and what happened there. Those individuals, war criminals maybe, were accused of genocide, but they never forcibly killed people. They just made them go on a death march. I'm not here to say that. I think they just wanted to displace them for less arable land that wasn't as desirable. And they pushed them to Oklahoma. So that's where there's a huge Native American presence in Oklahoma because of that, because of the reservations. Okay, having lived in Oklahoma, I've seen that too. Heck, they make amazing fireworks on their reservations and have really impressive, cool opportunities, but they were forcibly removed. Okay, Jackson's setting up a very interesting standard, and also in terms of marginalization of minorities, we see a pattern happening in the U.S. as we're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it happens. It's like the cost of progress, I guess, that as countries get bigger, as teams get bigger. Think about that. If any of you have been part of a prominent athletic team or extracurricular, as a debate coach, I see this. You get bigger, 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 and you get better, 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 but in the process, there is that human element, that touch that is lost. Inevitably, it happens. It's just part of that process, which is unfortunate. Finding that balance is always hard, and the U.S. is no different. Okay, let's now get to our next section called Indian Resistance. This is an interesting silver lining for those of you who have American Indian heritage, etc. There are three things you're going to write down in this section on Indian resistance. Right? We know the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, Trail of Tears. The Seminole, a little different. After dealing with the Cherokee in Georgia, the troops went down to Florida to deal with the Seminole. So think of the 7,500 troops, of the federal troops, if you will, that Jackson was able to mobilize. He has them monitor and push them out. Half of the Cherokee die. They then turn their attention to the Seminole tribe in Florida. And we're talking swampiness. We're not talking Miami area, Everglades, some of the Everglades. But we're talking sort of central, a little bit of southern Florida, Panhandle area, both on the Gulf area and the Atlantic Ocean area. Seminole tribe. They turn their attention in there. If any of you have been to Florida, Florida not only is a huge state, but good night, there is some vegetation there and wildlife. Woo! Absolutely very exotic for U.S., I'd say. Arizona heat, Alaskan interesting craziness, and Florida's, I don't want to say versatility, but just exotic nature makes the U.S. have some interesting parts of it, so to speak. Not as temperate as some might say for those examples. Anyway, so they put, that's the first thing you're writing down, they put all their troops and they go down to Florida to focus on the Seminole. Okay, same old, did all the other tribes. Wrong. Second thing you're going to write down. After losing thousands, think about it, 7,500 to begin, after losing thousands, not a full half, but almost a third of their troops, and spending $20 million and 4 years. 4 years. Federal government gives up. So after spending $20 million, 4 years, the federal government gives up. It's pretty interesting. So 4 years, $20 million. They couldn't suppress, oppress, and push out the Seminole tribe from Florida. That's why this is the third thing you're going to write down. To this day, the Seminole tribe has the best track record in beating the American government. To this day, of all Native American tribes, legally, yes, militarily, and territorially, the Seminole tribe has the best track record in beating the American government. That doesn't mean, again, it's good or bad or otherwise, that like, yeah, we want to beat the American government. No. But it's an interesting side note that all these other tribes were pushed out, but the Seminole, because of the vegetation. Think about our own troubles in Vietnam and parts of Afghanistan, where like guerrilla warfare is, it's hard to actually root those areas out, right? In Seminole tribe, it's the same idea. They knew the land, they knew the vegetation, and they held strong. And that's why the Florida State University has a unique agreement with the Seminole tribe where they get proceeds from the selling of merchandise, etc., because there's a mutual respect of like, whoa, these are those noble savages, that they truly held their own ground against the federal government. And to this day, even when it comes to monthly checks, yearly checks, not of reparations, but of actual the federal government in terms of these stipends, etc., for the Seminole tribe, no tribe usually can outmatch the amount of money that the Seminole tribe gets because of their land holdings and their management of their lands and their relationship with the federal government. So that's really interesting. All right. So that's the main takeaway. We're going to get into, we've talked about this pattern here for Indian American treatment, and we're going to get into some of the underlying areas as we get into Reconstruction next time, right, which will sort of get us caught up more or less with the other U.S. history classes and everything, and get some of, I think, maybe Terrell's class caught up. We will see an interesting angle of what was the U.S.'s response to slavery. Yes, Civil War will be there, but how are they handling this thing constitutionally and legally? What does that set a precedent for in terms of multi-ethnic marginalization for the future? Because, again, unlike LGBTQ plus rights or even of different nationality rights, ethnicity is that weird thing because it's face value, right? You see. And then we start to create different standards and patterns, which is interesting, where we've got to handle those things. So that's what we're going to get to next time under part 3, right, of this Civil War section, and what that means in terms of African Americans, right? Okay, so that's what we have here. I saw a thumbs down on one of the other videos. Okay, I'm going to find it out who did that, because I don't like these whole thumbs down things in these videos. They're perfect. They're immaculate. They're totally factual. Well, they are, but it was so funny. I saw that thumbs down, and I took such personal offense to it. And I was like, what? Thumbs down? So I guess my career in YouTube is not to be. Oh, well. But you'll still see the videos coming pretty much every other day, right? So in this case, Monday, you guys would be looking for an upload. I hope you guys have a great weekend and doing well in this social distancing experiment. Okay, thanks. Bye.